Almost all the opinions we have are taken on authority and on credit. There is no harm in this. We cannot make a worse choice than our own in so feeble an age. The version of the sayings of Socrates that his friends have left us, we approve only out of respect for the universal approval these sayings enjoy, not by our own knowledge. They are beyond our experience. If anything of the kind were brought forth at this time, there are few men who would prize it. We perceive no charms that are not sharpened, puffed out, and inflated by artifice. Those which glide along naturally and simply, easily escape a sight so gross as ours. We need a clear and well-purged sight to discover their secret light. Is not naturalness, according to us, akin to stupidity and a matter for reproach? Socrates makes his soul move with a natural and common motion. So says a peasant, so says a woman. His mouth is full of nothing but carters, joiners, cobblers, and masons. His are inductions and similes drawn from the commonest and best known actions of men. Everyone understands him. Under so mean a form, we should never have picked out the nobility and splendor of his admirable ideas. We, who consider flat and low all ideas that are not raised up by learning, and who perceive richness only in pomp and show. Our world is formed only for ostentation. Men inflate themselves only with wind, and go bouncing around like balls. This man did not propose to himself any idle fancies. His aim was to furnish us with things and precepts that serve life really and more closely. To keep the mean, to hold our aim in view, and follow nature. Lucan. He was also always one and the same, and raised himself, not by sallies but by disposition, to the utmost point of vigor. Or, to speak more exactly, he raised nothing, but rather brought vigor, hardships, and difficulties down and back to his own natural and original level, and subjected them to it. For in Cato, we see very clearly that his is a pace strained far above the ordinary in the brave exploits of his life, and in his death we feel that he is always mounted on his high horse. The other walks close to the ground, and at a gentle and ordinary pace treats the most useful subjects, and behaves, both in the face of death and in the thorniest trials that can confront us, in the ordinary way of human life. It happened, fortunately, that the man most worthy to be known and to be presented to the world as an example should be the one of whom we have most certain knowledge. We have light on him from the most clear-sighted men who ever lived. The witnesses we have of him are wonderful in fidelity and competence. It is a great thing to have been able to impart such order to the pure and simple notions of a child that, without altering or stretching them, he produced from them the most beautiful achievements of our soul. He shows it as neither elevated nor rich. He shows it only as healthy, but assuredly with a very blithe and clear health. By these vulgar and natural motives, by these ordinary and common ideas, without excitement or fuss, he constructed not only the best regulated, but the loftiest and most vigorous beliefs, actions, and morals that ever were. It is he who brought human wisdom back down from heaven, where she was wasting her time, and restored her to man. with whom lies her most proper and laborious and useful business. See him plead before his judges. See by what reasonings he rouses his courage in the hazards of war. What arguments fortify his patience against calumny, tyranny, death, and his wife's bad temper. There is nothing borrowed from art and the sciences. Even the simplest can recognize in him their means and their strength. It is impossible to go back further and lower. He did a great favor to human nature by showing how much it can do by itself. We are each richer than we think, but we are trained to borrow and beg. We are taught to use the resources of others more than our own. And nothing does man know how to stop at the limit of his need. Of pleasure, riches, power, he embraces more than he can hold. His greed is incapable of moderation. I find that it is the same with the curiosity for knowledge. Man cuts out for himself much more work than he can do or has any reason to do, trying to stretch the usefulness of knowledge as wide as its matter. In learning, as in all other things, we suffer from intemperance. Seneca. And Tacitus is right to praise Agricola's mother for having curbed in her son too boiling an appetite for learning. Looked at steadily, it is like men's other goods. It has in it much intrinsic and natural vanity and weakness, and it costs dear. It is far more hazardous to acquire than any other food or drink. For in other things, what we have bought we carry home in some vessel, and there we have a chance to examine its value and how much we shall take of it, and when. But learning we can at the outset put into no other vessel than our mind. We swallow it as we buy it, and leave the marketplace already either infected or improved. There is some of it that only hampers and burdens us instead of feeding us, and also some which, under color of curing us, poisons us. I once took pleasure in seeing men in some place, through piety, take a vow of ignorance, as one might of chastity, poverty, penitence. It is also castrating our disorderly appetites, to blunt that cupidity that pricks us on the study of books, and to deprive the soul of that voluptuous complacency which tickles us with the notion of being learned. And it is accomplishing richly the vow of poverty, to add to it also that of the mind. We need hardly any learning to live at ease, and Socrates teaches us that it is in us, and the way to find it and help ourselves with it. All this ability of ours that is beyond the natural is as good as vain and superfluous. It is a lot if it does not load us down and bother us more than it serves us. Little learning is needed for a good mind. Seneca. These are feverish excesses of our mind, a meddlesome and restless instrument. Collect yourself. You will find in yourself nature's arguments against death, true ones, and the fittest to serve you in case of necessity. They are the ones that make a peasant and whole nations die as steadfastly as a philosopher. Should I have died less cheerfully before having read the Tusculans? I think not. And now that I find myself close to death, I feel my tongue has grown richer, my courage not at all. This is as nature made it for me, and arms itself for the conflict in a common and ordinary way. Books have served me not so much for instruction as for exercise. What if knowledge, trying to arm us with new defenses against natural mishaps, has imprinted in our fancy their magnitude and weight more than her reasons and subtleties to protect us from them? There are subtleties indeed, with which he often alarms us very idly. Authors, even the most compact and the wisest, around one good argument, see how many others they strew, trivial ones, and if you look at them closely, bodiless. These are nothing but verbal quibbles to deceive us. But inasmuch as this may be done usefully, I do not want to expose them any further. There are enough of that sort in this book in various places, either from borrowing or from imitation. Yet we should take a little care not to call strength what is only nicety, or solid what is only acute, or good what is only beautiful, which delight more tasted than drunk. Cicero. Not all that entertains us sustains us. When it is a question not of the wit, but of the soul. Seneca. To see the trouble to which Seneca puts himself to be prepared for death, to see him sweat from the exertion of stealing and reassuring himself, and writhe about interminably on his perch, would have shaken his reputation with me if he had not very valiantly maintained it in dying. His agitation, so burning, so frequent, shows that he was hot and impetuous himself. The great soul speaks more relaxedly and assuredly. There is not one color for the mind, another for the soul. Seneca. We have to convince him at his own expense, and it shows perceptibly that he was hard pressed by his adversary. Plutarch's manner, inasmuch as it is more disdainful and less tense, is, to my mind, all the more virile and persuasive. I would easily believe that the movements of his soul were more assured and more regulated. The one, sharper, pricks us, startles us, touches our mind more. The other, more sedate, forms us, settles and fortifies us constantly, touches our understanding more. The former ravishes our judgment, the latter wins it. I have likewise seen other writings, still more revered, which in portraying the conflict their authors sustain against the goads of the flesh, show these so stinging, so powerful, and invincible that we, who are of the refuse of the people, have as much to wonder at in the strangeness and unheard of vigor of their temptation as in their resistance. To what end do we keep forcing our nature with these efforts of learning? Let us look on the earth at the poor people we see scattered there, heads bowed over their toil, who know neither Aristotle nor Cato, neither example nor precept. From them nature every day draws deeds of constancy and endurance, purer and harder than those that we study with such care in school. How many of them I see all the time who ignore poverty? How many who desire death, or who meet it without alarm and without affliction? This man who is digging up my garden this morning, he buried his father or his son. The very names by which they call diseases relieve and soften their harshness. Phthisis is a cough to them. Dysentery, looseness of the bowels. Pleurisy, a cold. And according as they name them mildly, so also they endure them. A disease must be very grave to interrupt their ordinary work. They take to their beds only to die. That simple and open virtue has been converted into obscure and subtle knowledge. Seneca. I was writing about this the time when a mighty load of our disturbances settled down for several months with all its weight right on me. I had on the one hand the enemy at my door, on the other hand the freebooters, worse enemies. They fight not with arms but with vices. Livy. And I was sampling every kind of military mischief all at once. To right and left appears the dreaded foe, on either side the threat of instant woe. Ovid. Monstrous war. Other wars act outward. This one acts also against itself, eats and destroys itself by its own venom. It is by nature so malignant and ruinous that it ruins itself together with all the rest, and tears and dismembers itself with rage. We see it more often dissolving of itself than for lack of any necessary thing, or through the power of the enemy. All discipline flies from it. It comes to cure sedition, and is full of it. We chastise disobedience, and sets the example of it, and employed in defense of the laws, plays the part of a rebel against its own laws. What have we come to? Our medicine carries infection. Poison to our disease are all these remedies. Grows all the stronger, all the sicker, with the cure. Virgil. Our mad confounding of all good and ill has made the gods avert their righteous will. Catullus. In these epidemics one can distinguish at the beginning the well from the sick, but when they come to last, like ours, the whole body is affected, head and heels alike. No part is free from corruption, for there is no air that is inhaled so greedily, that so spreads and penetrates, as does license. Our armies are no longer bound and held together except by foreign cement. A Frenchman, one can no longer form a steadfast and disciplined army corps. How shameful! There is only so much discipline as borrowed soldiers show us. As for ourselves, we follow our own lead and not our leaders. Every man has his own way. The leader has more trouble within than without. It is for the commander to follow, court, and bend, for him alone to obey. All the rest is free and dissolute. It pleases me to see how much baseness and pusillanimity there is in ambition, or how much abjection and servility it must attain its goal. But this displeases me, to see decent natures, capable of justice, grow corrupt every day in managing and commanding this confusion. Long sufferance begets custom, custom, consent, and imitation. We had enough ill-born souls without spoiling the good and generous ones, so that, if we keep this up, there will hardly be anyone left to whom to entrust the health of the state, in case fortune restores it to us. At least, do not prevent this youth from bringing aid to a disordered world. Virgil. What has become of that ancient precept, that soldiers should fear the leader more than the enemy, and that wonderful example of the apple tree that happened to be enclosed within the precincts of a Roman army camp, and was found the next day when they broke camp, leaving the owner the entire quart of his delicious ripe apples? I wish your youth, instead of the time they spend on less useful peregrinations and less honorable apprenticeships, should put half of it into witnessing naval warfare under some good captain commander of roads, and half into observing the discipline of the Turkish armies, for theirs has many differences from ours, and advantages over ours. This is one, that our soldiers become more licentious on expeditions, theirs more restrained and timid. For offenses or thefts committed against humble people, which are punished with the bastinado in peacetime, are capital offenses in war. For an egg taken without paying, the predetermined penalty is 50 blows with a stick. For anything not suitable for food, however trivial, they are impaled or decapitated without delay. I was amazed to see in the history of Selim, the most cruel conqueror that ever was, that when he subjugated Egypt, the wonderful gardens around the city of Damascus, abounding in delicate fruits, and all open and unenclosed, remained undespoiled by the hands of his soldiers. But is there any disease in a government so bad that it is worth combating with so deadly a drug? Not even, said Favonius, the usurpation of tyrannical authority over state. Plato likewise does not consent to have the repose of his country violated in order to cure it, and does not accept an improvement that costs the blood and ruin of the citizens, ruling that it is in the duty of a good man, in that case, to let everything alone and merely to pray God to lend extraordinary aid. And he seems offended with his great friend Dion for having proceeded a little bit differently. I was a Platonist on that score before I knew there had been a Plato in the world. And if this personage, Plato, must be completely excluded from our Christian fellowship, he who, by the sincerity of his conscience, had enough merit with the divine favor to penetrate so deeply into the light of Christianity through the general darkness of the world of his time, I do not think it becomes us well to let ourselves be taught by a pagan how great an impiety it is to accept no help from God that is simply his own, and without our cooperation. I often doubt whether among so many men who meddle in such a business, a single one has been found of so feeble an understanding as to have been genuinely persuaded that he was moving toward reformation by the worst of deformations, that he was heading for his salvation by the most express ways that we have of very certain damnation, that by overthrowing the government, the authorities, and the laws under whose tutelage God has placed him, by dismembering his mother and giving the pieces to her ancient enemies to gnaw on, by filling the hearts of brothers with parricidal hatreds, by calling the devils and the furies to his aid, he could bring help to the sacrosanct sweetness and justice of the divine word. Ambition, avarice, cruelty, vengeance, do not have enough natural impetuosity of their own. Let us spark them and fan their flames by the glorious title of justice and piety. No worse state of things can be imagined than where wickedness comes to be legitimate, and, with the leave of the authorities, assumes the cloak of virtue. Nothing is more deceptive in appearance than a depraved religion, in which the will of the gods is offered as a pretext for crimes. The extreme of injustice, according to Plato, is when what is unjust is held to be just. The people suffered very greatly at that time, not only present losses. In all fields reigned such confusion, Virgil, but future also. The living had to suffer, so did those who were not yet born. They pillaged them, and consequently me too, even of hope, snatching from them all they had to provide for the living for many years. The brutal horde destroys whatever they can't impound, and burns innocent hovels to the ground. Ovid. In walls there is no trust. The ravaged fields are bare. Claudian. Besides this shock, I suffered others. I incurred the disadvantages that moderation brings in such maladies. I was belabored from every quarter. To the Ghibelline I was a Guelph, to the Guelph a Ghibelline. One of my poets says this well, but I do not know where it is. The situation of my house and my acquaintance with men in my neighborhood presented me in one aspect, my life and my actions in another. There were no formal accusations, for there was nothing they could sink their teeth into. I never transgressed the laws, and if anyone had proceeded against me, he would have been found guiltier than I. It was mute suspicions that were current secretly, for which there is never a lack of apparent grounds in such a mixed-up confusion, any more than there is of envious or inept minds. I ordinarily assist the unfair presumptions against me that fortune sows by a way I have always had of avoiding, justifying, excusing, and interpreting myself, thinking that it is compromising my conscience to plead for it. For clarity is lessened by argument. Cicero. And as if everyone saw into me as clearly as I do myself. Instead of retreating from the accusation, I advance to meet it and rather enhance it by an ironic and mocking confession, if I do not flatly keep silent about it as about something unworthy of an answer. But those who attribute this to an over-haughty confidence show me hardly less ill will than those who attribute it to the weakness of an indefensible cause, especially the great, toward whom lack of submission is the ultimate offense, and who are rough on any righteousness that is aware of itself and does not feel itself to be abject, humble, and suppliant. I have often bumped myself on that pillar. At all events, over what happened to me then, an ambitious man would have hanged himself, and so would an avaricious man. I have no sort of concern with acquiring. Let me keep what I have, or even less, and live just for myself, whatever life the gods may give. Horse. But the losses that befall me through others' wrongdoings, whether by theft or violence, hurt me about as much as they do a man who is sick and tormented with avarice. The injury has immeasurably more bitterness than the loss. 1,000 different kinds of troubles assailed me in a single file. I would have suffered them more cheerfully in a single pile. I already considered to whom among my friends I could commit a needy and unfortunate old age. After letting my eyes wander all over, I found myself stripped to my shirt. To let oneself fall plumb down and from such a height, it must be into the arms of an affection solid, vigorous, and favored by fortune. These are rare, if there are any. In the end, I recognized that the surest thing was to entrust myself and my need to myself, and that if it happened that I was lodged only coolly in fortune's favors, I should recommend myself all the more strongly to my own favor, and attach myself and look all the more closely to myself. In all things, men cast themselves on the resources of others to spare their own, which alone are sure and alone powerful, if we know how to arm ourselves with them. Every man rushes elsewhere and into the future, because no man has arrived at himself. And I resolved that these were useful troubles. First, because bad students must be instructed with the rod when reasons cannot do the job, as by fire and by the force of wedges we restore a warped piece of wood to straightness. I have long been preaching to myself to stick to myself and break away from outside things. Nevertheless, I still keep turning my eyes to one side. Inclination, a favorable word from a great man, a pleasant countenance, tempt me. God knows if there is any scarcity of those in these times, and how little they mean. I still listen without frowning to the seductions that are held out to me to draw me into the marketplace, and I defend myself so softly that it looks as if I would prefer to succumb to them. Now a spirit so indocile needs some beatings, and we need to knock together and tighten the hoops with good mallet strokes on this cask that is splitting its seams, cracking up, and falling completely to pieces. Second, because this misfortune served me as practice to prepare myself for worse, just in case I, who through the generosity of fortune and the nature of my character hope to be one of the last, come to be one of the first to be caught by the storm, teaching me in good time to restrict my way of life and arrange it for a new state of things. True freedom is to have power over oneself for everything. He is most powerful who has power over himself. Seneca. In an ordinary, tranquil time, a man prepares for moderate and common accidents, but in this confusion that we have been in for 30 years, every Frenchman, whether as an individual or as a member of the community, sees himself at every moment on the verge of the total overthrow of his fortune. Therefore, we must keep our courage supplied with stronger and more vigorous provisions. Let us be grateful to destiny for having made us live in an age that is not soft, languid, and idle. Many a man who could never have been famous by any other means will make himself famous by his misfortune. As I seldom read in histories of such commotions in other states without regretting that I could not be present to consider them better, so my curiosity makes me feel some satisfaction at seeing with my own eyes this notable spectacle of our public death, its symptoms and its form. And since I cannot retard it, I am glad to be destined to watch it and learn from it. Thus do we eagerly seek to recognize, even in shadow and in the fiction of the theaters, the representation of the tragic play of human fortune. Not that we lack compassion for what we hear, but the exceptional nature of these pathetic events arouses a pain that gives us pleasure. Nothing tickles that does not pain, and good historians avoid peaceful narratives as if they were stagnant water and dead sea, in order to get back to the seditions and wars to which they know that we summon them. I doubt if I can decently admit at what little cost to the repose and tranquillity of my life I have passed more than half of it amid the ruins of my country. The patience with which I bear misfortunes that do not affect me personally is rather too small a price to pay, and before complaining to myself, I consider not so much what is taken away from me as what I still keep safe, both within and without. There is consolation in dodging now one, now another of the evils that aim at us successively and strike elsewhere around us. Also, in the matter of public calamities, the more universally my sympathy is dispersed, the weaker it is. Besides, almost certainly, we feel public calamities only so far as they concern our private affairs. Livy. And the state of health from which we started was such that it is itself a solace for the regret that we should have for it. It was health, but only in comparison with the sickness that followed it. We have not fallen from very high. The corruption and brigandage that enjoy dignity and established status seem to me the least endurable. We are robbed less wickedly in a forest than in a place of safety. There was a universal conjunction of members, each individually vying in rottenness with the others, and most of them afflicted with age-old ulcers which no longer admitted of cure or asked for it. So this collapse truly stimulated rather than crushed me with the help of my conscience, which bore itself not only peaceably but proudly, and I found no reason to complain of myself. Also, since God never sends men evils any more than goods entirely unmixed, my health for that time was unusually good. And just as without health I can do nothing, so with it there are a few things I cannot do. It gave me the means to rouse all my resources, and to put out my hand to ward off the blow that would otherwise easily have made a deeper wound. And I found that with my endurance I had some foothold against fortune, and that I would need a great shock to throw me out of my saddle. I do not say this to irritate her into making a more vigorous attack on me. I am her servant. I hold out my hands to her. In God's name, let her be satisfied. Do I feel her assaults? Indeed I do, as those whom grief overwhelms and possesses, yet let themselves, at intervals, be caressed by some pleasure, and a smile escapes them. So I too have enough power over myself to make my ordinary condition peaceable and unburdened of painful imaginings. But once in a while I fail to keep my guard up against the strings of these unpleasant thoughts, which overcome me even as I am arming myself to drive them away or to wrestle with them. Now a further increase of trouble came upon me following the others. Both outside and inside my house, I was greeted by a plague of the utmost virulence. For as healthy bodies are subject to graver illnesses because they can be overcome only by these, so the very salubrious air of my place, where in the memory of man no contagion, even though in the neighborhood, had been able to get a foothold, became poisoned and produced strange results. Young men and old, commingled, crowd the tomb. No head escapes ruthless Proserpina. Horace. I had an absurd situation to put up with. The sight of my house was frightful to me. All that was in it was unguarded and abandoned to anyone who wanted it. I, who am so hospitable, had a great deal of trouble finding a retreat for my family. A family astray, a source of fear to their friends and themselves, and of horror whenever they sought to settle, having to shift their abode as soon as one of the group began to feel pain in the end of his finger. All illnesses are taken for the plague. People do not give themselves the time to recognize them. And the best part of all is that, according to the rules of the profession, after any approach to danger, you have to be 40 days in a trance of anxiety over that illness, with your imagination meanwhile working you up in its own way and turning even your health into a fever. All this would have affected me much less if I had not had to feel for the sufferings of others and serve for 6 months of misery as guide to this caravan. For I carry my own preservatives within me, which are resolution and patience. Apprehension, which is particularly feared in this disease, does not impress me much. And if I had been alone and wished to take flight, it would have been a much more cheerful and distant one. It is a kind of death that does not seem to me one of the worst. It is generally quick, numbed, painless, consoled by the public situation, without ceremony, without mourning, without a crowd around. But as for the people round about, not the 100th part could save themselves. You may see the shepherd's realms deserted, and the fields vacated far and wide. Virgil. In this place, the best part of my revenue is from manual labor. The land that 100 men work for me has lain idle for a long time. Now, what example of resoluteness do we not see in the simplicity of this whole people? Each man universally gave up caring for his life. The grapes remained hanging on the vines, the principal produce of the country, as all prepared themselves indifferently, and awaited death that evening or the next day, with face and voice so little frightened that it seemed that they had made their peace with this necessity, that they were under a universal and inevitable sentence of death. Death is always that. For on how little depends our resoluteness in the face of death. A few hours difference in our distance from it, the mere consideration of having company, makes our apprehension of it different. See these people, because they are dying in the same month, children, young people, old people. They are no longer stunned. They no longer bewail one another. I saw some one who feared to remain behind, as in a horrible solitude, and found them generally to be concerned only about their burial. It pained them to see the bodies scattered amid the fields, at the mercy of the animals that promptly appeared in swarms. How divergent human fancies are. The Neorites, a nation in which Alexander subjugated, throw the bodies of the dead into the deepest parts of their forest to be devoured, the only sepulchre considered happy among them. Here's a man, healthy, was already digging his grave. Others lay down in them while still alive, and one of my laborers, with his hands and feet, pulled the earth over him as he was dying. Was that not taking shelter so as to go to sleep more comfortably? And undertaking rather comparable in loftiness with that of the Roman soldiers who were found after the battle of Cannae, with their heads thrust into the holes that they had made and filled up with their hands, suffocating themselves. In short, a whole nation was suddenly, by habit alone, placed on a level that concedes nothing in firmness to any studied and premeditated fortitude. Most of the instructions that learning uses to encourage us are more showy than powerful, and more ornamental than effective. We have abandoned nature, and we want to teach her her lesson. She who used to guide us so happily and so surely, and yet the traces of her teaching, and the little that remains of her image, imprinted by the benefit of ignorance on the life of that rustic, unpolished mob. Learning is constrained every day to go and borrow, to give its disciples models of constancy, innocence, and tranquility. It is fine to see these disciples, full of so much beautiful knowledge, obliged to imitate that stupid simplicity, and imitate it in the primary actions of virtue, and a fine thing that our sapience learns from the very animals the most useful teachings for the greatest and most necessary parts of our life. How should we live and die, husband our possessions, love and bring up our children, maintain justice, a singular testimony of human infirmity, and that this reason of ours that we handle as we will, always finding some diversity and novelty, leaves in us no apparent trace of nature. And men have done with many arguments and far-fetched reasonings that she has become variable and particular for each man, and has lost her own constant and universal consonance, and we must seek in the animals evidence of her that is not subject to favor, corruption, or diversity of opinion. For it is indeed true that they themselves do not always go exactly in nature's road, but they deviate from it so little that you can always perceive its ruts. Just so, horses that are led by hand do indeed leap and prance about, but not beyond the strength of their halters, and nonetheless, they still follow the steps of the man who leads them. And so the hawk takes its flight, but under the restraint of the leash. Meditate upon exile, torture, wars, diseases, shipwreck, so that you may not be a novice to any misfortune. Seneca. Of what use to us is this curiosity to anticipate all the ills of human nature, and prepare ourselves with so much trouble to encounter even those which are perhaps never to touch us? The possibility of suffering makes us as unhappy as the suffering. Seneca. We are struck not only by the blow, but by the wind and the noise of it. Or, why go right now, like the most feverish, for it certainly is a fever, and have yourself whipped, because it may happen some day that fortune will have you whipped, and put on your furred gown on Midsummer Day, because you will need it at Christmas. Hurry up and experience the evils that may befall you, especially the most extreme. Test yourself in them. They say, make sure. On the contrary, the easiest and most natural thing would be to unburden even our thoughts of them. Apparently, they will not come soon enough. Their true being does not last us long enough. Our mind must extend and prolong them, incorporate them into itself, and dwell on them beforehand, as if they did not weigh reasonably upon our senses. They will weigh heavily enough when they are there, says one of the masters, not of some tender sect, but of the hardest. Meanwhile, favor yourself, believe what you like best. What good does it do you to welcome and anticipate your bad fortune, to lose the present through fear of the future, and to be miserable now because you are to be so in time? Those are his words. Learning doubtless does us a good service by instructing us very exactly about the dimensions of evils, whetting with cares the minds of mortal men. Virgil. It would be a pity if part of their greatness escaped our feeling and knowledge. It is certain that to most people, preparation for death has given more torment than the dying. It was once said truly, and by a very judicious author, the senses are less affected by the suffering than by the thought of it. Quintilian. Sometimes the very feeling that death is at hand animates us with a prompt resolve no longer to avoid a thing that is completely unavoidable. Many gladiators in times past have been seen, after fighting like cowards, to swallow death courageously, offering their throat to the enemy's sword and inviting it. The prospect of a more distant death needs a courage that is steady and consequently difficult to come by. If you don't know how to die, don't worry. Nature will tell you what to do on the spot, fully and adequately. She will do this job perfectly for you. Don't bother your head about it. To know the hour of death, in vain you strive, mortals, and by what road it will arrive. Propertius. It gives less pain to bear a certain sudden blow. Long to endure a life of fear is greater woe. Maximianus. We trouble our life by concern about death, and death by concern about life. One torments us, the other frightens us. It is not against death that we prepare ourselves. That is too momentary a thing. A quarter hour of suffering, without consequence, without harm, does not deserve any particular precepts. To tell the truth, we prepare ourselves against the preparations for death. Philosophy orders us to have death ever before our eyes, to foresee and consider it before the time comes, and afterward gives us the rules and precautions to provide against our being wounded by this foresight and this thought. That is what those doctors do who make us ill so that they may have something on which to employ their drugs and their art. If we have not known how to live, it is wrong to teach us how to die, and make the end inconsistent with the whole. If we have known how to live steadfastly and tranquilly, we shall know how to die in the same way. They may boast about it all they please. The whole life of a philosopher is a meditation on death. Cicero. But it seems to me that death is indeed the end, but not therefore the goal of life. It is its finish, its extremity, but not therefore its object. Life should be an aim unto itself, a purpose unto itself. Its rightful study is to regulate, conduct, and suffer itself. Among the many other duties comprised in this general and principal chapter on knowing how to live is this article on knowing how to die, and it is one of the lightest, if our fear did not give it weight. To judge by utility and natural truth, the lessons of simplicity yield little to those which learning preaches to us to the contrary. Men are diverse in inclination and strength. They must be led to their own good according to their nature and by diverse routes. Wherever the tempest drives me, there I land. Horse. I never saw one of my peasant neighbors cogitating over the countenance and assurance with which he would pass this last hour. Nature teaches him not to think about death except when he is dying, and then he has better grace about it than Aristotle, whom death oppresses doubly, both by itself and by such a long foreknowledge. Therefore, it was Caesar's opinion that the least premeditated death was the happiest and the least oppressive. He suffers more than is necessary who suffers before it is necessary. Seneca. The bitterness of this imagination springs from our curiosity. We are always impeding ourselves in this way by trying to anticipate and overrule the prescriptions of nature. It is only for the learned to dine the worse for the idea of death when in perfect health, and to knit their brows at it. The common people need neither remedy nor consolation except when the blow falls, and consider only precisely as much of it as they feel. Isn't that what we say? That the stupidity and lack of apprehension of the vulgar gives them this endurance of present troubles and this profound nonchalance about sinister accidents to come, that their souls, because they are thick and obtuse, are less penetrable and unstable. For heaven's sake, if that is so, let us henceforth hold the school of stupidity. Learning promises us no greater boon than this, to which stupidity so gently leads its disciples. We shall have no lack of good teachers, interpreters of the simplicity of nature. Socrates will be one, for as far as I can remember, he speaks in about this sense to the judges who are deliberating over his life. I am afraid, gentlemen, that if I entreat you not to put me to death, I shall involve myself in the charge of my accusers, which is that I claim to be wiser than others, as having some more hidden knowledge of the things that are above and below us. I know that I have had no association or acquaintance with death, nor have I known anyone who has had experience of its qualities to inform me about it. Those who fear it presuppose that they know it. As for me, I know neither what death is like, nor what it is like in the other world. Perhaps death is something indifferent, perhaps desirable. It is likely, however, that if it is a transmigration from one place to another, it is an improvement to go and live with so many great persons who have passed on, and to be exempt from having any more to do with unjust and corrupt judges. If it is an annihilation of our being, it is still an improvement to enter upon a long and peaceful night. We feel nothing sweeter in life than a deep and tranquil rest and sleep without dreams. The things that I know to be bad, like wronging our neighbor and disobeying our superior, whether God or man, I carefully avoid. Those which I do not know to be either good or bad, I cannot fear. If I am going off to die and leave you alive, the gods alone can see with whom it will go better, you or me. Wherefore, as far as I am concerned, you will decide as you please. But according to my habit of advising just and profitable things, I do indeed say that, for the sake of your conscience, you will do better to set me free, unless you see further into my case than I do. And if you judge according to my past actions, both public and private, according to my intentions, and according to the profit that so many of our citizens, young and old, derive every day from my conversation, and the good that I do you all. You cannot duly discharge your obligation to my merit, except by ordering that, in view of my poverty, I be maintained in the Parentium at the public expense, which I have often known you to grant to others with less reason. Do not take it as obstinacy or disdain that I do not follow the custom and supplicate you and try to move you to commiseration. I have friends and relatives, not being, as Homer says, born of wood or stone any more than others, capable of presenting themselves in tears and mourning, and I have 3 weeping children to move you to pity. But I would bring shame on my city at my age and with such reputation for wisdom as here I am accused of, to stoop to such cowardly behavior. What would people say of the other Athenians? I have always admonished those who have listened to me not to redeem their life by a dishonorable action. And in my country's wars, at Amphipolis, at Poradea, at Delium, and others that I have been in, I have shown in action how far I was from guaranteeing my safety by my shame. Moreover, I will be trying to harm your sense of duty and inviting you to do ugly things, for you should not be persuaded by my prayers, but by the pure and solid reasons of justice. You have sworn to the gods to abide by the laws. It would seem that I wanted to suspect you and countercharge you with not believing that there are any gods, and I would actually be testifying against myself that I did not believe in them as I should, distrusting their guidance and not committing my affair purely into their hands. I trust in them for everything, and hold it for certain that in this they will do what is best for you and for me. Good men, living or dead, have nothing to fear from the gods. Is that not a sober, sane plea, but at the same time natural and lowly, inconceivably lofty, truthful, frank, and just beyond all example, and employed in what a critical need? Truly he was right to prefer it to the one that the great orator Lysaeus had put in writing for him, excellently fashioned in the forensic style, but unworthy of so noble a criminal. Should people have heard a supplicating voice from the mouth of Socrates? Should that proud virtue have quit at the height of its display? And should his rich and powerful nature have committed his defense to art, and, in its loftiest test, renounced truth and sincerity, the ornaments of his speech, to bedeck itself with the makeup of the figures and fictions of a memorized oration? He did very wisely, and like himself, not to corrupt an incorruptible tenor of life and such a saintly model of human nature, in order to prolong his decrepitude by a year and betray the immortal memory of that glorious end. He owed his life not to himself, but to the world as an example. Would it not be a public loss if he had finished it in an idle and obscure fashion? Assuredly, such a nonchalant and mild way of considering his death deserved to have posterity consider it all the more on his behalf, which it did. And there is nothing in justice so just as what fortune ordained for his glory. For the Athenians held those who had been the cause of his death in such abomination that they shunned them like excommunicated persons. They considered everything they had touched as polluted. No one would wash with them at the baths. No one greeted them or said hello to them, so that finally, no longer able to bear this public hatred, they hanged themselves. If anyone thinks that among the many examples of the sayings of Socrates that I might have chosen to serve my purpose, I selected this one badly, and if he judges that this speech is elevated above common ideas, I choose it deliberately, for I judge otherwise, and hold that it is a speech which in its naturalness ranks far behind and below common opinions. It is an unstudied and artless boldness, and a childlike assurance. It represents the pure and primary impression and ignorance of nature. For it may be believed that we are naturally afraid of pain, but not of death for its own sake. It is a part of our being, no less essential than life. To what purpose would nature have engendered in us a hatred and horror of death, seeing that it holds a rank of very high utility with her in fostering the succession and vicissitude of her works, and that in this universal commonwealth it promotes birth and increase more than loss or ruin. Thus is the universe renewed. Lucretius. From one death come 1,000 lives. Ovid. The failing of one life is the passage to 1,000 other lives. Nature has implanted in the animals an instinct for taking care of themselves and for their preservation. They go so far as to be afraid of being injured, of knocks and wounds, are fettering and beating them. Accidents, subject to their sense and experience, but they cannot fear our killing them, nor have they the faculty of imagining or inferring death. So it is further said that they are seen not only to suffer it gaily, most horses neigh at their death, swans greet it with song, but moreover to seek it out in their need, as many examples of elephants show. Besides, isn't the method of arguing that Socrates uses here equally admirable in its simplicity and its vigor? Truly, it is much easier to talk like Aristotle and live like Caesar than it is to talk and live like Socrates. There lies the extreme degree of perfection and difficulty. Art cannot reach it. Now, our faculties are not so trained. We neither essay them nor know them. We invest ourselves with those of others, and let our own lie idle. Even so, someone might say of me that I have here only made a bunch of other people's flowers, having furnished nothing of my own but the thread to tie them. Indeed, I have yielded to public opinion in carrying these borrowed ornaments about on me, but I do not intend that they should cover and hide me. That is the opposite of my design. I who wish to make a show only of what is my own, and of what is naturally my own. And if I had taken my own advice, I would, at all hazards, have spoken absolutely all alone. I load myself with these borrowings more and more heavily every day, beyond my intention and my original form. Following the fancy of the age and the exhortation of others, if it is unbecoming to me, as I believe it is, no matter, it may be useful to someone else. Some people quote Plato and Homer who have never looked at them, have taken enough passages elsewhere than at their source, without trouble and without competence, having a library of 1,000 volumes around me in this place where I write. I will presently borrow, if I please, from a dozen such matchmakers, people whom I do not often leaf through, enough to bedeck this treatise on Physiognomy. I need only the preliminary epistle of some German to stuff me with quotations. This is the way we go begging and appetizing glory, to cheat the fools of this world. These concoctions of commonplaces, by means of which so many men husband their study, are hardly useful except for commonplace subjects, and they serve to show us off, not to guide us. A ridiculous fruit of learning, which Socrates belabors so comically against Euthydemus. I have known books to be made out of things never either studied or understood, the author entrusting to various of his learned friends the search for this and that material to build it, contenting himself, for his part, with having planned the project and piled up by his industry this stack of unfamiliar provisions. At least the ink and the paper are his. That in all conscience is buying or borrowing a book, not making one. It is teaching men not that you can make a book, but what they might have been in doubt about, that you cannot make one. A magistrate was boasting in my presence of having heaped up 200-odd quotations from others in a single decision he had written. By proclaiming this to everybody, he seemed to me to efface the glory that people were giving him for it. A pretty and absurd boast, in my opinion, for such a subject and such a person. I, among so many borrowings of mine, am very glad to be able to hide one now and then, disguising and altering it for a new service, at the risk of letting it be said that I do so through failure to understand its original use. I give it some particular application with my own hand, so that it may be less purely someone else's. These others put their thefts on parade and into account, and so they have better credit with the laws than I. We naturalists judge that the honor of invention is greatly and incomparably preferable to the honor of quotation. If I had wanted to speak from knowledge, I would have spoken earlier. I would have written at a time nearer to my studies, when I had more wit and memory, and would have trusted myself more to the vigor of that age than of this one, if I had wanted to make a profession of writing. Moreover, one gracious favor that fortune perhaps offered me by the mediation of this work would then have come in a more propitious season. Two of my acquaintances, great men in this ability, have, in my opinion, lost by half for having refused to publish at 40 in order to wait until 60. Maturity, like youth, has its defects, and worse ones, and old age is unsuited to this sort of work as to all others. Whoever puts his decrepitude into print plays the fool if he hopes to squeeze out of it humors that do not smell of ungraciousness, dreaminess, and drowsiness. Our mind grows constipated and sluggish as it grows old. I speak ignorance pompously and opulently, and speak knowledge meagerly and piteously, the latter secondarily and accidentally, the former expressly and principally. And there is nothing I treat specifically except nothing, and no knowledge except that of the lack of knowledge. I have chosen the time when my life, which I have to portray, lies all before my eyes. What is left is more related to death, and even of my death, if I should find it garrulous, as others do, I would willingly give an account to the public on my way out. About Socrates, who was a perfect model in all great qualities, it vexes me that he hit on a body and face so ugly as they say he had, and so incongruous with the beauty of his soul. He who was so madly in love with beauty, nature did him an injustice. There is nothing more likely than the conformity and relation of the body to the spirit. It matters a great deal in what sort of body the soul is lodged, for there are many things about the body that sharpen the mind, many that blunt it. Cicero. This man is speaking of an unnatural ugliness and deformity of limbs. But we also call ugliness and unattractiveness at first glance, which resides chiefly in the face, and often arouses our distaste for very slight causes. The complexion, a spot, a rugged expression, or some inexplicable cause, when the limbs are symmetrical and perfect. The ugliness which clothed a very beautiful soul in La Boétie was in this category. This superficial ugliness, which is very imperious for all that, is less prejudicial to the state of the spirit, and not very certain in its effect on men's opinion. The other, which is more properly called deformity, is more substantial and more apt to strike home inwardly. Not every shoe of smooth leather, but every well-formed shoe shows the form of the foot within. So Socrates said of his ugliness that it betrayed what would have been just as much ugliness in his soul if he had not corrected it by training. But in saying this, I hold that he was jesting according to his wont. So excellent a soul was never self-made. I cannot say often enough how much I consider beauty a powerful and advantageous quality. Socrates called it a short tyranny, and Plato the privilege of nature. We have no quality that surpasses it in credit. It holds the first place in human relations. It presents itself before the rest, seduces and prepossesses our judgment with great authority and a wondrous impression. Tyranny would have lost her case even in the hands of an excellent attorney, if, opening her robe, she had not corrupted her judges by her dazzling beauty. And I find that Cyrus, Alexander, Caesar, those three masters of the world, did not forget beauty in carrying out their great affairs, nor did Scipio the elder. One and the same word in Greek embraces the beautiful and the good, and the Holy Ghost often calls good those whom it means to call beautiful. I would readily uphold the ranking of good things found in a song taken from some ancient poet, which Plato says was widely known: health, beauty, riches. Aristotle says that to the beautiful belongs the right to command, and that when there are any whose beauty approaches that of the images of the gods, veneration is likewise their due. To one who asked him why people frequented beautiful persons longer and more often, he said, "That question is proper only for a blind man." Most philosophers, and the greatest, paid for their schooling and acquired wisdom by the mediation and favor of their beauty. Not only in the men who serve me, but also in animals, I consider it as within 2 fingers' breadth of goodness. Yet it seems to me that the cast and formation of the face, and those lineaments from which people infer certain inward dispositions, and our fortunes to come, are things that do not fall very directly and simply under the heading of beauty and ugliness, any more than every good odor and clear air promises health, or every closeness and stench promises infection in time of pestilence. Those who accuse the ladies of belying their beauty by their character do not always hit the mark, for in a not too well formed face there may dwell an air of probity and trustworthiness, as, on the contrary, I have sometimes read between 2 beautiful eyes threats of a malignant and dangerous nature. There are favorable physiognomies, and in a crowd of victorious enemies you will instantly choose, among men unknown to you, one rather than another to whom to surrender and entrust your life, and beauty has no real part in the choice. The face is a weak guarantee, yet it deserves some consideration, and if I had to whip the wicked, I would do so more severely to those who belied and betrayed the promises that nature had implanted on their brows. I would punish malice more harshly when it was hidden under a kindly appearance. It seems as if some faces are lucky, others unlucky, and I think there is some art to distinguishing the kindly faces from the simple, the severe from the rough, the malicious from the gloomy, the disdainful from the melancholy, and other such adjacent qualities. There are beauties not only proud but bitter, others are sweet, and even beyond that, insipid. As for prognosticating future events from them, those are matters I leave undecided. As I have said elsewhere, I have very simply and crudely adopted, for my own sake, this ancient precept, that we cannot go wrong by following nature, that the sovereign precept is to conform to her. I have not, like Socrates, corrected my natural disposition by force of reason, and have not troubled my inclination at all by art. I let myself go as I have come. I combat nothing. My two ruling parts, of their own volition, live in peace and good accord. But my nurse's milk, thank God, was moderately healthy and temperate. Shall I say this in passing, that I see held in greater price than it is worth a certain idea of scholastic probity, almost the only one practiced among us. A slave to precepts, held down beneath fear and hope. What I like is the virtue that laws and religions do not make, but perfect and authorize. That feels in itself enough to sustain itself without help, born in us from its own roots, from the seed of universal reason that is implanted in every man who is not denatured. This reason, which straightens Socrates from his inclination to vice, makes him obedient to the men and gods who command in his city, courageous in death, not because his soul is immortal, but because he is mortal. It is a ruinous teaching for any society, and much more harmful than ingenious and subtle, which persuades the people that religious belief is enough, by itself, and without morals, to satisfy divine justice. Practice makes us see an enormous distinction between devoutness and conscience. I have a favorable bearing, both in itself and in others' interpretation. What did I say? I have? Cremes? I mean, I had. Terence. You see, alas, only the bones of this worn body. Maximianus. One very unlike that of Socrates. It has often happened that on the mere credit of my presence and manner, persons who had no knowledge of me have placed great trust in me, both for their own affairs and for mine. And in foreign countries, I have derived singular and rare favors from this. But the following two experiences are perhaps worth my telling in detail. A certain person made a plan to take my house and myself by surprise. His scheme was to arrive alone at my door and press rather insistently for entry. I knew him by name, and had reason to trust him as a neighbor, and to some extent a relative of mine. I opened to him, as I do to everyone. Here he was, completely terrified, his horse out of breath, and all worn out. He entertained me with this bit of fiction, that he had just been set upon a half a league away by an enemy of his, whom I also knew, and I had heard of their feud. That this enemy had been wonderfully hot on his heels, and that, having been surprised in disarray, and weaker in number, he had sought safety at my door, that he was greatly troubled about his men, whom he said he supposed to be dead or captured. I tried quite naively to comfort, reassure, and refresh him. Soon after, up came 4 or 5 of his soldiers, with the same bearing and the same fright, wanting to come in, and then others and still others after them, well equipped and well armed, until there were 25 or 30 pretending to have the enemy at their heels. This mystery was beginning to arouse my suspicion. I was not unaware in what sort of an age I was living, how much my house might be envied, and I had several examples of others of my acquaintance to whom similar misadventures had happened. However, feeling that there was nothing to be gained by having begun to be pleasant if I did not go through with it, and being unable to get rid of them without ruining everything, I abandoned myself to the most natural and simple course, as I always do, and gave orders for them to come in. Besides, the truth is that I am, by nature, little given to distrust and suspicion. I am apt to lean toward the milder excuse and interpretation. I take men according to the common order, and do not believe in these perverted and unnatural inclinations, unless I am forced to by strong evidence, any more than in monsters and miracles. And besides, I am the sort of man who readily commits himself to fortune and abandons himself bodily into her arms, for which I have, up to now, had more occasion to applaud myself than to complain. And I have found her both wiser and more friendly to my affairs than I am. There have been some actions in my life, the conduct of which might justly be called difficult, or, if you wish, prudent. Even of those, put it that 1/3 was my doing, truly 2/3 were richly her doing. We err, it seems to me, that we do not trust ourselves enough to heaven, and we expect more from our own conduct than belongs to us. That is why our plans so often go astray. Heaven is jealous of the extent we attribute to the claims of human wisdom, to the prejudice of its own, and the more we amplify them, the more it cuts them down. These men remained on horseback in my courtyard, the leader with me in my main room. He had not wanted to have his horse stabled, saying that he had to withdraw as soon as he had news of his men. He saw himself master of his undertaking, and nothing now remained but its execution. He has often said since, for he was not afraid to tell the story, that my face and my frankness had disarmed him of his treachery. He remounted his horse, his men constantly keeping their eyes on him to see what signal he would give them, very astonished to see him go away and abandon his advantage. Another time, trusting in some truce or other that had just been proclaimed between our armies, I started on a journey through an extraordinary ticklish part of the country. They had no sooner got wind of me than rode up 3 or 4 groups of horsemen from different places to catch me. One of them reached me on the 3rd day, when I was attacked by 15 or 20 masked gentlemen, followed by a wave of mounted archers. There I was, seized and made prisoner, withdrawn into the thick of a neighboring forest, unhorsed, my valleys seized, my coffers searched, my money box taken, horses and equipment divided among new masters. We were a long time in that thicket, disputing over the matter of my ransom, which they set so high that it was quite apparent that I was scarcely known to them. They started a big dispute over my life. In truth, there were many threatening circumstances that showed the danger I was in. Now you need all your courage, now a steadfast heart, Aeneas. Virgil. I kept standing on my rights under the truce, which were to give up to them only the gain they had made in despoiling me, which was not to be despised, without promise of any other ransom. After we had been there 2 or 3 hours, and they had mounted me on a horse that was not likely to escape them, and had committed me to the particular care of 15 or 20 musketeers, and scattered my men among some others, with orders that we should be led as prisoners by different routes. And after I had already been taken a distance of 2 or 3 harquebus shots away, having prayed for help to Castor and to Pollux, Catullus, behold, a sudden and very unexpected change came over them. I saw the leader return to me with gentler words, taking pains to search for my belongings, scattered among the troop, and having them returned to me as far as they could be recovered, even including my money box. The best present they made me was finally my freedom. The rest did not concern me much at that time. The true cause of so unusual an about-face and change of mind, without any apparent motivation, and of such a miraculous repentance at such a time, in a premeditated and deliberate enterprise which had been made lawful by custom. For from the outset I openly confessed to them what party I belonged to and what road I was taking. I truly do not even now well know. The most conspicuous among them, who took off his mask and let me know his name, repeated to me then several times that I owed my deliverance to my face and the freedom and firmness of my speech. which made me undeserving of such a misadventure, and he asked me to assure him of similar treatment should the occasion arise. It is possible that the divine goodness willed to make use of this vain instrument for my preservation. It also protected me the next day from other, worse ambushes, of which these very men had warned me. The second of these men is still on his feet to tell the tale. The first was killed not long ago. If my face did not answer for me, if people did not read in my eyes and my voice the innocence of my intentions, I would not have lasted so long without quarrel and without harm, considering my indiscreet freedom in saying, right or wrong, whatever comes into my head, and in judging things rashly. This habit may with reason appear uncivil and ill-adapted to our usage, but I have not known anyone who judged it to be injurious or malicious, or who took offense at my freedom if he had it from my own lips. Words, when reported, have a different sense, as they have a different sound. Moreover, I hate no one, and I am so squeamish about hurting that, for the service of reason itself, I cannot do it. And when occasions have summoned me to sentencing criminals, I have tended to fall short of justice. I wish there were no more crimes committed than I have the heart to punish when they have been committed. Livy. They say that Aristotle was reproached for having been too merciful to a wicked man. In truth, he said, I was merciful to the man, not to the wickedness. Ordinary judgments are exasperated to vengeance by the horror of the misdeed. That very thing cools mine. Horror at the first murder makes me fear a second, and hatred of the first cruelty makes me hate any imitation of it. To me, who am only a jack of clubs, may apply what they said about Charillus, king of Sparta. He could not possibly be good, since he is not bad to the wicked. Or else thus, for Plutarch presents it in these two ways, as he does 1,000 other things, variously and contrastingly. He must certainly be good, since he is good even to the wicked. As I do not like to take a hand in legitimate actions against people who resent them, so, to tell the truth, I am not scrupulous enough to refrain from taking a hand in illegitimate actions against people who consent to them.